There are an estimated 476 million indigenous people living in 90 countries and territories. They represent around 6% of the world's population and belong to as many as 5,000 different cultures. The Indigenous Peoples Movement is one of the most robust social movements ever seen in our recent global history. What did the indigenous peoples did to get the world to recognize them is a story of an exceptional nature. In the 1970s, indigenous peoples from around the world began to approach the United Nations as a site where they could pursue their quest for their rights, their recognition, and their self-determination. The story of how and what the indigenous peoples won, especially the unique rights of participation at the United Nations, deserves to be seen as a critical milestone in the history of the making of the New World. Indigenous peoples have knocked at the door of international institutions several times. As early as 1923, Cayuga Chief Descahe, representing the Six Nations of the Iroquois, also known as the Haudenosaunee, traveled to Geneva to the then League of Nations to plead for the cause of his people. A similar journey was made by Maori leader W.T. Ratana in protest against the breaking up of the 1820 Treaty of Waitangi and the loss of Maori control of their lands. A new indigenous peoples diplomacy thus took roots, leading them onto a global stage, and in the process making an indelible mark in the protecting of rights and recognitions of indigenous peoples and indigenous nations from around the world and their inalienable rights to self-determination. The right to self-determination has been a cornerstone of indigenous peoples' demand, and its recognition is indeed a true historical landmark. Indigenous peoples had to struggle to be recognized as peoples, and this is now a reality. Self-determination for indigenous peoples means a nexus of several rights. The right to self-identify as indigenous and to decide who their members are. The right to have institutions which preserve the distinctness of indigenous peoples' ways of lives. Self-determination also means the right to free, prior, and informed consent in crucial areas. Not everyone understands that human rights are dynamic and evolving. One of the biggest changes the indigenous movement was the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the year 2007. These came after 25 long years of mobilization by indigenous people and negotiation with member states. Indigenous people's remarkable persistence and advocacy also gave birth to the Convention number 169 of the International Labour Organization, as well as the Regional American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People not only recognizes individual rights, but also group rights, such as the right to land and the right to choose their own modes of development, governance, education, and modes of medical treatment, etc. Together with the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the victories of global indigenous peoples movement also have included the following. First, the creation of the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations, the creation of the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the creation of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the creation of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the International Decade of Indigenous Languages.
Ari nyauba munda nyauba guna shina jak dami kausu ko ganchi nya kipamo minya astang rik siri shakatisha chi hatun jakta guna bi ri mari shakatiki minyu kuchikta ganya rik singona.
went to Geneva in 77. It was a delegation of leaders that were fighting for their recognition as nations. Because we couldn't find any justice in the lands that we were at, we said, well, let's. And it was a revelation to many people around the world that indigenous people were still here.
We usually say we came to the UN first because we were not able to solve our problems in our countries. The second is because we understand that at the international level, the governments are setting standards, and we need our voice to be heard at those levels. But we also need that those standards that are being defined includes indigenous people's rights and indigenous people's perspective.
Well, for us, it's very unique in a way because it was very specifically focused on treaty. Our elders and our spiritual leaders at home had been very, very concerned about violations of Treaty Number 6, our treaty, by our treaty partners. And they said to me, well, to us, that we have to go back to the international arena.
And I will never forget when I gave my first intervention and I pressed the button on the microphone and saw, knowing that it was being translated across these languages, my first ever time of speaking publicly. But the pressing of that button is for me a symbol of the beginning of a new chapter in my life. So we spent a year working out what is intellectual property rights, and then after a few years we convened the meeting that produced the Mātātua Declaration on the cultural and intellectual property rights of Indigenous peoples.
At the United Nations, the indigenous peoples advocate for their issues, their rights, as they face the states. Among the most significant years on the advance of the indigenous rights in Africa region was the year 2000. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights was established the working group on indigenous populations or indigenous communities.
The 13th of September 2007 will be remembered as International Human Rights Day for indigenous peoples of the world, a day that the United Nations and its member states, together with indigenous peoples, reconciled with past painful histories and decided to march on into the future on the path of human rights. This is the declaration which sets the minimum international standards for the protection and promotion of the rights of indigenous peoples.
Today, the greatest challenge stems from climate crisis, environmental violence, and wars over indigenous lands and territories. Located in ancestral sites in sensitive biodiversity regions of the world, indigenous peoples' movement and their wisdom will lead the way. Informed by history, it is all about taking the wisdom of the past to inform the present and self-determine the future. The efforts for healing peoples, for peace and the planet will thus continue by the bravery, the courage of indigenous peoples' movement.